Ravi's got Leviticus, and we already read Genesis 4. So if somebody wants to grab that Deuteronomy passage, while you're looking that up, Ravi, do you have Leviticus ready to go?
Yeah, sure, sir. And the Lord said to Moses, Speak to the priests, the son of Aaron, and say to them, None shall defile himself for the dead among his people, except for his relatives who are nearest to him, his mother, his father, his son, his daughter, and his brother. Also his virgin sister who is near to him, who has had no husband, for her he may defile himself. Otherwise he shall not defile himself, being a chief man among his people, to profane himself.
Before we go on, I want to explain why I wanted to read this passage. The high priest this is talking about restrictions on the high priest. And this is if a family member dies, because he has responsibilities to the entire nation, he is restricted on who he can prepare for burial. Touching a dead body makes you ritually unclean, and you can't go into the temple. And you especially could not serve as a high priest and touch any of the holy objects in the temple or the tabernacle, depending on what era this is. But it does say that the high priest, he can defile himself for an immediate blood relative. He can prepare his father or his mother or his son or daughter, or also a sister if she is unmarried. He can prepare them for burial himself. That will defile him. He'll be unclean, and he won't be able to serve in the temple for however long it takes to get through that process to become cleansed from that defilement. But he cannot do this for his wife. He shall not defile himself as a relative by marriage among his people, and so profane himself. There are some differences in translations. ESV is similar to the NASB. It says, he shall not make himself unclean as a husband among his people, and so profane himself. The difference in translation, which is going to be relevant here in a bit, between what I just read and what Ravi read, is the word for husband. The word for husband there is Baal, the same as the pagan god, because that's not really a proper name. Baal is not the name of a pagan god. It's the title, and it means master. It's also the Hebrew word for husband. This is why Paul has chosen this analogy in particular to talk about this change in status from a slave to sin to a slave to God, because of this authority relationship. So he shall not make himself unclean as a husband among his people, and so profane himself. The reason for this is that his relationship to his wife died when she died. When she died, she is no longer his wife. Whereas his father and mother, his children, they are related to him by blood. They are still his father and mother or children when they die. I don't understand exactly how that works. But something about that relationship continues on even after death. And we can see this in statements like Jacob or Abraham saying that they're going to go be with their fathers. When Jacob makes Joseph promise to bury him in the Canaan, he says, don't bury me here in Egypt, take me back and bury me with my fathers. And there's this phrase that's used in the Bible to say when somebody dies, they go to be with their fathers. And that relationship persists through death for whatever reason. I don't know why God did it that way, but he did. Marriage, on the other hand, ends at death. And Yeshua talks about this when he talks about how in the resurrection, nobody that whoever you were married to before, you're not married to them now. There's no marriage or giving in marriage after the resurrection. Anyways, this just illustrates that the marriage relationship ends at death. Does anybody have Deuteronomy 25? If not, I think I've got it up here. Okay, I'll go ahead and read this one. When brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a strange man. Not meaning a weird man, just somebody outside the tribe. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as a wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And this is the law of the levirate, where if a man dies childless, if he's married, then his wife is to marry his brother, if he's got one, and produce an heir for him. and we see this actually play out in scripture with the story of Judah and Tamar and Judah's sons, and then again later with Ruth and Boaz. It's kind of complicated and very strange to our modern sensibilities, but what it illustrates is that once again, that marriage ends at death. And Yeshua referenced this one also when the Sadducees came to him. The Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection. So, they came to him and said, this man married a wife and then he died without any children and she married his brother and so on through all 7 brothers. So in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? And of course, they're trying to mock him. And he says, well, she won't be anybody's wife because marriage ends at death. The whole levirate marriage wouldn't be possible. It would be adultery if marriage didn't end at death. And God doesn't command adultery. So clearly it's not. Even though technically scripture never says anywhere that, the Torah doesn't say anywhere that marriage ends at death. The commands that Torah does give make that a requirement. It's a logical prerequisite to the levirate marriage. Verse 1, or do you not know, brothers, for I am speaking to those who know the law, that the law is binding on a person only as long as he lives. What does it mean that the law, the Torah, is binding on a person? Does that mean that they're obligated to obey it? Or does it mean something else?
Does binding mean like joined to?
Yeah, it's talking about an authority relationship.
I think the language, at least that's how it reads to me, is that when it talks about know and then binding and then lives, I don't think it's speaking of physical life. I think it's saying that if you are living in such a way that you are resistant to the instructions heart-wise, then it ends up being a master that you don't want. So you actually end up being in bondage to it because your nature is always working against it. But the law becomes freedom for you if you submit to the Spirit. You naturally have a want to instead of a I have to.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's totally true. I'm not sure that that's what he means here, but I totally agree with what you're saying. The idea that the law is binding on a person, you remember how in the Leviticus passage, I said that Paul is using this husband and wife analogy because he was familiar with how the Hebrew language treated the relationship. In Hebrew, there's no word for wife. It was a man's woman. And the only word for husband is Baal or master. There may be other words that are used in those places in certain contexts, but generally those were the words used. There was another word for a concubine, which is a particular type of wife, but it's not really relevant to our conversation right now. Verse 2, for a married woman is bound by law to her husband while he lives. I'm reading the King James because then I've got the Strong's numbers here. And it's a little more literal than the ESV. For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. This phrase here, which hath an husband, that's really only one word, hupandros or hupandros. And it literally means under a husband. He's choosing this word on purpose to parallel with the phrase huponomos, which means under law. They're essentially the same Greek construction, except one of them is a phrase and 2 words, and one of them is a single word, a compound word. So in this relationship, the woman is under her husband, just as a person is under law, because he has this authority relationship with it. He's bound to it. Let me go back to the ESV here because it's so much easier to see and read. The law is binding on a person because you have this relationship with the law, because it is your master, because you broke it. That's the binding that it has. And it's very similar to what you were saying, Ebony, about how when you are resisting it, it becomes your master, because you are a slave to sin, which is the same thing as saying you are a slave to the law. Because you broke the law, now it's your master. Paul is saying that relationship ends when you die. And in this case, you're right on point again by saying that this is a spiritual principle. It's true physically. The law, well, in a sense, one part of the law's penalty ends when you die physically, but the eternal consequences go on. But the thing is that when Yeshua dies and took us through the grave with him, we died spiritually and are resurrected. And that binding of the law on us spiritually ends. Our flesh is still here fighting with the law. We are still bound to sin in a sense because we are always struggling with it. But we are no longer bound to the eternal consequences of the law because we died with Yeshua and were resurrected again in a new life. Going on to verse 2 to 3. For a married woman is bound by law to her husband while he lives, but if her husband dies, she is released from the law of marriage. Accordingly, she will be called an adulteress if she lives with another man while her husband is alive. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law. And if she marries another man, she is not an adulteress. A couple of cautions about this passage. It is frequently taken to illustrate points that it wasn't intended. You know, if we're in a conversation, say I'm telling you about how to drive, and I say, if you run a stoplight, that is against the law. You're not allowed to do that. If you're ever driving a vehicle, the light turns red, you're supposed to stop. But is that always true? If I were actually talking to an ambulance driver, that wouldn't always be true. And when Paul is making this analogy, when anybody is making an analogy, it's important to remember the context in which the analogy is made. What is the purpose of the analogy? So Paul is not teaching us about marriage here. He's not teaching us about marriage or divorce or remarriage. That's not the point. He is teaching us about our relationship to the law and to sin in God. And he's using marriage as an illustration of that. So there are some things that, you know, we can kind of derive from what Paul is saying, but those things aren't the main point, and you have to be careful with that. They're implications of what Paul is saying rather than his direct teaching. And so they might be wrong. For example, one of the things that I might take out of this, since Paul is purposefully taking a relationship that both Greeks and Hebrews would have thought of as an authority relationship, I might derive from this that Paul is emphasizing the authority relationship of a husband and wife, that a wife is under the authority of her husband. But that's not Paul's point. Even if I think that's true, that's not what he's trying to teach us. Just leave it at that. He is trying to teach us that there is a relationship that we have established between us and the law by breaking it. And once we have that relationship and it is our master, the only way that it can be broken is through death. Now, if we die, that breaks that relationship, but now we're in the grave and we're already condemned. We can't redeem ourselves by dying. All we can do is accept the penalty of the law. So what happens instead? Yeshua died. And because of his perfect righteousness, his death is capable of atoning for the sins of all people. When you die, you break that relationship that you have with sin. And Yeshua did that for us. His death counts as ours spiritually. And we're set free from that mastery. And now we are free to become slaves to another master. The law is no longer our master. Now God can be our master. That doesn't mean the law died. We are the ones who died, not the law. The law is still there. It still has a relationship with us. It's just a different relationship. The law becomes a tool that we can use for our benefit rather than a master who uses us for its.